good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening. Welcome to the Living Streams Deep Dive podcast. We're going to be diving in, like we always do, into the sermon from this last week. I'm joined by Ryan Romeo, who preached out of Psalms 126. So we'll hang out there, and we'll probably bounce all around.
125.
125.
But I wanted 126. We'll talk about that.
But we're going to dance around with 126 a little bit,
yes,
too, because poor Ryan desperately wanted to preach that one.
Yeah.
But that's what the podcast is for, preaching what you didn't get to preach.
That's right.
And on my right over here, we have David McVicker, our worship pastor, also OG partner in crime of mine.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of you don't know, but
in the loft.
When David McVicker first came to Living Streams, I was the high school pastor, and he came on as the high school worship leader, and we hung out a lot and did a lot of weird, ridiculous, embarrassing things.
Yeah, it was good. Lots of
and used to shred on the saxophone, but now he shreds the Word of God.
Before I came to the Lord, I was on the saxophone.
Yeah, and poor McVicker literally was just in the studio at the wrong time.
Yeah, I was.
We said, hey, you want to stay when we turn the cameras on and hang out and talk with us a little bit?
My office is actually right there. So.
Yeah. So we roped him in.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, the danger.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, would you mind giving us a quick little flyover of your message on Sunday, and then we'll start chatting?
Yeah. I think as I was going through it, we're going through the Psalms of Ascent, and I think initially I was on Psalm 124. There's this, we can't hit every single one of them, so we're skipping a couple. And then I was reading Psalm 126, and I was like, oh, I really like that. It's super positive. I like that, But Psalm 125 kind of stopped me in my tracks, and there was just a little bit of a flow in it that, to some extent, was a bit reminiscent of 123, which is what I preached on a couple weeks ago. But the beginning of the psalm starts off, "Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever." And I think this is, especially in the Psalms, you read things like that, and there's a bit of a tension there, right? Like you read that and you go, man, trusting in the Lord, it's absolutely this thing that helps you to overcome so many things in your life. But I don't know if that would make it where I would say I cannot be moved, and that I would abide for. There's that tension where you're going, sometimes I do really great, and sometimes honestly I'm moved. Sometimes I'm moved off of that. But it's this prayer, right? It's and it's this reminder, and I think that's where I ended up landing, is going, look, trusting in the Lord relies on the Lord and your ability to surrender to Him, and that's ultimately where my sermon prep started, was around that, which is eventually where I landed the sermon. But I think that really is it. It's okay, if you want to be that sort of person that's immovable in a movable world, it doesn't rely on you trying to muster up more strength. It really is that blessing of trusting in the Lord. And then it moves on. It's the Lord surrounds His people like the mountains surround Jerusalem, and so there's this sort of physical protection of the Lord, and then it moves on to the section that says, "For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous," which we'll unpack in just a little bit. But that was a section that was okay, I think I need to unpack this. And I was reading it 4th of July weekend, and I was thinking, as any preacher does, it's how much do I want to say about, the country I live in? And it's become one of those things that it's okay, careful, But I was going, I just think something needs to be said about the righteousness of a people and how important that is. And not necessarily trying to call out politics or anything, but just going, look, this sort of the moral compass of a society matters, and that's what this is talking about. And then ends with just this kind of I think a real beautiful, it's a softer prayer than 123. 123 is, have mercy on us, for we've had more than enough of contempt, Our soul has had more than enough. There's this just sort of cry of the heart. And 125 is a little softer, but it still finishes with the same sort of call for justice. And it says, "Do good, O Lord, to those who do good, and to those who are upright in their hearts." This call of, I hate to see when good people, when bad things happen to good people. And that's a place of theological wrestling and everything else, but it's a place of just bringing that to the Lord, It's that sort of messiness of just going, it's okay. Or if you're frustrated right now, that's fine. Frustrated about the world or your kids or your boss or whatever. and you feel like the wicked are prospering and the good are being punished, if that's how you feel, fine, bring it to the Lord. He can handle it. And the Psalms don't shy away from that. And I love that about this. Like the Psalms of Ascent are this like climbing up, like I was saying on Sunday, there's 12 Psalms of Ascent. And there were 12 steps that went into the temple. And so people are like, maybe these were crafted around that. And
12 or 15?
15. Sorry, 15. Yes, you're right. Yeah, 15.
I only
15
remember that
steps.
sharply because I just re-listened to your sermon.
Yes,
You said 15 on Sunday.
I was testing you.
Yep.
Yeah. 15. And so there's those 15 steps, and you're like, okay, maybe it's that. And then, 126 is that real clear call out of, man, once we came out of exile, like we were so excited. And so there's this kind of steady climb up that happens in the Psalms of Ascent that's really, really interesting. But it's not shallow. Like it's still engaging in the, hey, you're feeling frustrated by injustice. That's okay. Bring that in, sing that to the Lord. That's fine. And the Psalms are a lot more messy than people think they are. Like you would think people are like, oh, great, like a worship series. And you're like, well, there's a lot of rough Psalms. Like there's a lot of very guttural, raw, from the heart, I'm really frustrated God type Psalms. And I think that's kind of where this psalm lands in a softer way than 123 did. But that call for justice, that sort of frustration when you look at the world around you. So, yeah.
And I think that's something that's like, I think whoever compiled the Psalms of Ascent, whoever stitched them together,
yeah,
which I would say really, I mean, this is something we've talked about a little bit in the past, you and me, I don't know, on the podcast or whatever, but, when we talk about this scary word, that the editors of the Old Testament, which, if that word makes you feel uncomfortable, go listen to Tim Mackey with the Bible Project talk about that, and you come out feeling like, oh, that's not a scary thing. I think people talk about that a little bit. We have a tendency to avoid, recognizing that there were people who came to edit and compile the Old Testament, because we have this silly notion that like the Lord just teleported it down, the whole Bible in its current form.
Yeah.
But when you hear Tim Mackey talk about it, right, he talks about it, the metaphor he uses, I love, is like that of a family quilt. This meaningful quilt that like started with great-great-great-great-great-grandma when she stitched a couple patches into it, and over the generations, more meaningful things that carry profound identity have been stitched into it.
Yeah.
And Psalms is one of the places we can look to most clearly to say there was an editor. This stuff was compiled.
Yeah.
You have Psalms, like you mentioned on Sunday, Psalms of David, Psalms of the sons of Korah, Psalms of Solomon, Psalms of who knows who, Psalms that are composed.
Some that are, they say to Moses. Like this is, so you're like, this is a long period of time
over the course of hundreds of years. And then in Psalms, in the book of Psalms, you have a moment when it says, and here ends the Psalms of David. And then some while later, you have more Psalms of David.
Yes, yeah.
And so there's very clear, it's not hiding the fact that like, oh, this has been stitched together.
Yeah.
And the Psalms of Ascent are no exception to that. These Psalms that were collected over the course of who knows how long, and were stitched together for purpose.
Yeah.
And all of that, you can't just say the word, editor of the Old Testament without saying something there.
Sure. Yep.
All of that, which lends to the beauty of the Old Testament, specifically as it relates to the Psalms of Ascent, is to say, I think whoever compiled the Psalms of Ascent was also inspired by the Holy Spirit to put them together in a meaningful order, which actually is replicated. I think we could, if we wanted to. I don't think we need to or should right now, but we could talk about how the very structure of the temple, the tabernacle, is mirrored in the Psalms of Ascent a little bit. And the reason why I think both of those, at least on a high level, is a thought I'm having as I'm hearing you talk.
Yeah.
I think both of those, now I'm curious to pull on that thread, see how much it does.
Me too.
But I think both of those, just at this high level of, it's structured in a way that our hearts ascend to connect with the Lord.
Yeah.
And so there is this element of kind of bringing our frustration to the Lord that, precedes a space where we can rejoice and rest in the Lord.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where, the Psalms of Ascent, when you talk about it, it's like, I was saying this, like it was compiled after that, the time in exile in Babylon. But then you're like, okay, well, David wrote something that was far before all of that, chronologically. So clearly, it was kind of stitched together with this sort of history in mind. But even the entire book of Psalms, it's so interesting. I mean, it's split up into 5 different books. Psalms of Ascent are a subset of book 5 in the Psalms. But each book of the Psalms ends with this sort of Selah. It ends with something that honestly very much mirrors the 5 books of Moses, which is very interesting. So all of that it does not discount that these songs, and nobody's arguing that these Psalms weren't written by David, or I mean, some scholars do,
Some people
but we
are,
are, but yeah. But I'm like, but this is a compilation of something that is of the story of God. And ultimately, that's what I was really trying to hone us in on Sunday is, when you want to trust in the Lord, you could look at your own life and say, there's some great stories of God providing, and that's awesome. But at some point, those run out, and, like our team that's going to go plant a church. They haven't planted a church before, know? And I called Nathan yesterday. I was like, is it cool if I said that? He was fine with it. But I was like, it's true. They've never done that. So then why would they have confidence in it? Well, number one, the Lord called them to it, which is great. And then number 2, they get to borrow from the Lord doing this in the lives of many, many, many people in the past. And that's what's that kind of beautiful thing when we look at Psalms or any of that. It's like you get to go way back and go, here's a story of a human being, a lot like me, struggling with a lot of the same things that I do, following God and God showing up. And I get to borrow that faith to have confidence for what God's going to do in the future. It's a beautiful thing,
Yeah. David, I'm curious, just your perspective, right, as someone who has been spending a large portion of their life trying to help people to get into a place where you've ascended the hill, where you're connecting with the Lord, where you're in the Holy of Holies, in the presence. Like, what are some things that you have become aware of concerning like the human heart and the process that's common, or processes that are common for us to really enter into the presence of God? Like, what are some things that anybody listening could maybe like have some insight or input into their own heart that you've gained as being someone who professionally is trying to help people connect with Jesus?
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because there's a lot of things that the Lord talks about in the Word regarding worship or sacrifice or offering that aren't even necessarily the thing itself. Like we look at Jesus talking about someone coming to give an offering, and if they've sinned against their brother or haven't, righted that it's like, don't even do this, just go there and fix it. Yeah. Or, there's just so many different things that can affect the way that we're approaching the Lord. And so I think a lot of it really is, like Ryan and I were talking on Sunday, there's something I saw that was just basically saying, like, if you're waiting for your flesh to line up with your spirit for you to be able to worship, like you're waiting for you to just feel it, and then you're going to be seasonal at best, because there's going to be a lot of seasons, like the Psalms quickly point out, that our spirit's not going to align with our heart or our mind. And so I think it's really helpful when we look at the Psalms. There's a lot of things that are prescribed in there. You were talking about the tabernacle method, and I think the beginning of that is coming through the gates with thanksgiving and praise. That's one that people talk about a lot, and I've seen validity in that to my life. I mean, Ryan and I for a while were challenging each other to start our day with 5 minutes of thankfulness and just really sit down and think about everything that you can think about.
You're being gracious and saying we reminded each other. You reminded me like 90% of the time.
Yeah, but it was, I find that that's a really good practice to implement in your life, is just thankfulness. It's something I learned from my wife, but it's interesting. You guys should try this if you're watching the podcast right now. Just sit down and start a timer and just begin to thank God for everything that comes to your mind or everything you can think of. And I think unless you guys are just, been going at it for a while and you have a really thankful heart, and praise God, I'm so glad that is your reality. But I think most people, you're going to get to about a minute and a half to 2 minutes, and you're going to be like, man, I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel already.
Thank you for light bulbs, Lord.
Yeah, my eyebrows.
Thanks for my eyebrows.
I have shoes, thank you for that. And so
It's true.
it's such an interesting muscle that we can work on of thankfulness. It's more, there's kind of two categories that I separated into. Like there you have the posture of the heart and you have the posture of the body, right? And so one of the things that we can do obviously is thankfulness to I find that no matter where I'm at, no matter what I'm feeling, whether I'm feeling it, whether I'm not, if I just begin to thank God, a lot of times my posture can switch into gratefulness. And I feel like gratefulness is the beginning of having encounter with the Lord. The other part of that is the physical postures that we see throughout the Psalms, and I did a study on that for a teaching for the youth. And there's the lifting of hands, the bowing of your knees, falling on the ground. Shouting is a big thing in the Psalms for worship. I don't know how much you guys shout when you worship, but I feel like there's kind of like almost like a primal releasing of your hunger for the Lord in a shout. And I think it's a big thing corporately that we should probably be doing more. Maybe on Sunday we'll shout. Who knows? I think
it's something like even physiologically that happens. I think like CJ and you or somebody was talking about this, like there are like the Lord never just like leaves it to be just, I mean, it's something that you could study where you're like, you can actually see when somebody shouts or they sing with a group of people. I think I was saying that in a couple of sermons ago.
Yeah, you mentioned something along those lines in a message a year.
So funny. This is probably 2 weeks ago, and my brain has dumped that information.
I heard this really good sermon a while
Wait
back.
a minute. I think I said that.
CJ
no, but it was like that physiologically. Like when you sing together, it's like all of these things, like it affects... Like even it like reduces cortisol levels, so it actually changes the physical features of your face when you sing often together. Yeah, because cortisol has like this like weird effect on your face. So when you're singing in a group together, you're like, how cool is it of the Lord to be like, here's a spiritual reality for worship, but it's also echoed in the physical reality.
It's so good. I think CJ's also told me that like the same system that holds trauma in your body is the same system that's being engaged when you sing. Like the Lord created worship to like, really heal. Yeah, it's a healing thing. Yeah. You get down that rabbit hole though, and
it could get weird.
And then the frequencies and people start getting
you can get real weird with it. But no, it is interesting.
Science is catching up with the Word of God about how He's created us to worship.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many books I've read over the last few years that are like, here's this breakthrough meta understanding of all the information, all the science, and it's this, and this, and as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, like Bible's been saying that for 2,000 years.
Like the church has been doing that for millennia.
Like one of the books that I have that's become one of my go-to recommendations for people who are struggling with any sort of like sinful habits, or I mean, most often, right? It's individuals who are struggling with pornography addiction, but anything like that. Is a book called Atomic Habits. Yeah, have you guys read that?
Yeah, it's a good book.
Such a good book.
Great book.
100% biblical, zero Bible in it.
Yeah,
the author's not a Christian, as far as I know. No intention to, but it is 100%. Almost every single premise in there, I'm like, that you could have just skipped the scientific studies and gone right for the scripture.
Totally.
And have come to the same conclusions. Totally.
I remember one random story in that book. He was talking about how, you remember in the beginning, he talked about getting hit by the baseball bat and he lost, like, they were trying to see if he had brain damage from it. So they were like, one of the biggest tests that they would do is see if you could smell or taste, because like if you lose your taste or smell, that means you've gotten brain damage. And I had COVID that week. And I was like, is my brain getting damaged right now? Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
But that book was excellent. It was great. But all of these things, I mean, I think all of the, coming back to your posture, like heart posture and worship, I think that's why we read the Psalms and we study them, and they say such interesting things. But to remember that they were poetry and that there were songs. I mean, we were talking about a song that you wrote, like "Healer of My Body." There are these sort of real things that, like, which psalm was that? Was that 126? Yeah, restore fortunes. Let's see. Those who sow in tears, shall reap with shouts of joy.
And where can we listen to that song, David?
Yes.
Spotify, Apple Music, Pandora.
Check it out on Pandora.
Cassette tape. Hit me up for that one.
But it is like, you kind of forget, especially for those of us who are like Bible study guys, it's like, these were sung, and there's something about this. It's like they were And they weren't just sung alone. They were sung with a community. They were sung together. They were sung during festivals. They were sung with this real awakened heart, really paying attention to what they're singing. They're forming, sort of culturally habitual things that they do together based on these psalms, And they started off in a fiercely, private place, just like the songs that you guys write. But they eventually come out and everybody sings them together and they become part of the story. And the Psalms, it's like we've been singing these for thousands of years. It's been that same thing, and it's the Word of God coming alive to us. But that posture of the heart, I think, like really the trust in the Lord, kind of coming back to that. I thought about that a lot last week of going, what a simple phrase, but I don't know how much I've thought about that word, trusting in the Lord, That feeling of like the old Indiana Jones, the Temple of Doom, or maybe it was it was the third one, whatever the third one was.
Raiders of the Lost Ark?
No,
Last Crusade.
No.
Last Crusade. Yeah, there's somebody on the listening podcast going, "Come on, guys."
Sean Connery.
Sean Connery. Yeah. But that one where he's like, you've got to take a step of faith, and he does, and he steps out on the thing. Like so much of us think of trust like that, but I think that trust in the Lord is slowly built through hearing a lot of things, but then occasionally there's those moments, there's those moments where the Lord's like, you're standing on a cliff and I just need you to step out. And you're like, but I don't want to, everything in you is like, I just don't want to do this. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel like, that this is a logical thing. But when you have that, and to me, I think those aren't like daily things, and maybe they should be more daily. But I think to me, especially these big moments in life, like these happen, once or twice in a decade where you're like, okay, I'm taking a giant step here. And you trust the Lord, you feel confidence in the Lord, all of that. But there is still the step, like there's that, like, get your feet in the water before the Red Sea starts parting. Like there's a little bit of that. And I think all of this, those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion. They cannot be moved. The more you take those steps and the Lord takes care of you, the easier the next step is going to be. Because you're like, oh, he did it before. Okay, and the very first time you do that, it's going to feel like agony, But the 100th time you do it, it's like the saints that are like 89 years old or whatever. Yeah. They've been following the Lord a long time. They've seen a lot of hard seasons and they've seen the Lord come through in a lot of things. They're just not moved. They're just like, I trust the Lord, And it does create stability in a world that's full of a ton of instability.
Yeah.
I think circling back around to that thankfulness piece as you enter into worship, I think one of the most valuable things that I've learned about thankfulness is to thank God for the places where he met me in the past, the places where I had been delivered or where he had come through, like those little altars that you've built at those parts of your life where you've seen him come through. A lot of times that can be the most powerful thing in Thanksgiving because they never expire, you know, like that moment where the Lord worked, it's like with you forever. And I mean, even look like the first corporate worship song that we see in the Bible in the book of Exodus when they come out of the ocean and they sing the horse and rider song together with Moses and the congregation. It's like even in the Psalms, they go back to that and they talk about you as part of the sea and I don't know exactly where, but I know like they bring it up, and this is like many years after that happened, you know, because it didn't expire. Like the Lord delivering his people, like in your life or even in your family in this capacity, because they were remembering it from way back when.
Well, and it's that remembering and the thankfulness. Like, again, I think it creates part of the issue, I think, is sometimes we take a step of faith and then we don't build an altar to remember it. On Sunday,
which for anybody like is not like super familiar, right? That's something you see oftentimes in the scriptures where, especially the patriarchs, right? Like something happens, they build this altar to the Lord, and they'll name the altar or they'll attach the story. And hey, when your kids see these rocks, what do you tell them? Tell them the story of what happened.
Exactly.
It's a memento. Almost,
so that's
a monument.
That's it. You know, and sometimes it's something. You know, it doesn't always have to be something physical. I mean, I said this on Sunday. I'm a fan of journaling for that very reason. You get to go, oh yeah, I remember this time. But I told a story of my kids, like when we were in Peru, and it freaked us out because, you know, we were in this sort of child trafficking hotspot in the Amazon, and we let our little kids go out, and it freaked us out. They were in good hands. I mean, the missionaries that took them, we love them, trust them a lot. But as much as we trusted them, we had to trust the Lord with our kids, because it was like, I know you think that you're fine and you've lived here a long time, but I'm scared, But what was funny is I was thinking on Sunday, I was trying to think of a story like that, and I had kind of forgotten about that story, and it came to mind, and I was like, oh yeah. And I said this on Sunday, but it's it's easy for me to forget those moments. It's easy to go, I was scared. I didn't want to let my kids go, but they went. They had a great time. They came back safe and sound, and it was fine. And it's easy for me to take that and shelf that somewhere deep in the recesses of my brain, instead of going, oh, Lord, thank you. Thank you that you took care of them. I was really scared. We took a little mini step of faith, and you showed up and you took care of us, those are those sort of remember this. And I think there's so much of, you and I are both kind of deep into Old Testament right now, but so much of it is just remember what the Lord did. Remember what the Lord did. Write songs about it. Build altars about it. Do everything that you can. Write it down into a book, whatever you can, to remember what God did, because that's what helps the future generations trust in the Lord. There's really nothing else you could do. When you're young, you don't have enough of your own experiences to do that. So it's you need to do everything you can to remind my heart, remind me, Lord, that you're trustworthy.
Yeah, well, it helps those who are younger. It helps us. They become anchors for us. It's one of the thoughts I was having both on Sunday and in the context of this conversation on that first verse, right? That's saying, those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion; they'll not be moved. And you were talking about, I think you were maybe alluding to this a little bit. I don't know if this was a thought that was kind of in the undercurrent of what you were saying or not, but you may very well have been, or it could just be my brain went there and it was closely connected to what you were saying. But, you were talking about David coming in and it was one of the first places he conquered when he was taking...
coming into Jerusalem. Yeah.
And that had me thinking about, the context of the exiles singing this, or even those singing it as they're being exiled, right? And seeing, because Jerusalem, it existed before Israel was there. It existed under Israel, and it saw many people exercising authority over that city over the years, and still today. It goes back and forth, and I think it was you who was pointing this out, or somewhere, on the Temple Mount this very day sits a mosque.
Yes.
And it's changed hands so many times, but what hasn't gone anywhere is Mount Zion. Regardless of who is in authority over it. And so I actually, as I read this psalm, I don't think I'm just reading our current insecurities, politically, geographically, globally, whatever, into that. What I think part of what the psalmist is saying is hey, it doesn't matter who's in charge, because we know who's in charge. I think the psalmist is saying those who trust in the Lord, though they get conquered by the Philistines or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans, though they may get conquered, they're not moved.
I think that Mount Zion, and I think that Mount Zion is it's a call back to, again, what we were just talking about, the historical, looking back and going, this place is significant because of the story of what happened with David, And so it's a callback, because then it goes into straight geography next, which is they're surrounded, the mountains, surround Jerusalem. So are the people of God. So there's this surrounding nature. So that's a spiritual reality. The Mount Zion is a historical reality, and both of those are coming together. And the author's going, you can trust God because of the history, and you could trust God because of the geography, just maybe meaning he is surrounding you. We use that word, that sort of phrase all the time. But this is what it's saying is it's protected like the mountains protect Jerusalem. You are protected by the Lord. You're surrounded by the high ground. The Lord has the high ground in your life, and he's surrounding you, Yeah. But both of these kind of play together in one verse, which I find so, this is why we do these podcasts. But I was in my head, all of that was going on Sunday morning, but you can only bring so much of it out. But there is that historical aspect to it where it's oh yeah, when we first came into Jerusalem and when David first, like, it was the very first thing he does as king. It's like you see right in 2 Samuel, he becomes king, and then he goes straight in and conquers Mount Zion. And eventually it becomes the title for anything, right? Like, we dreamed of Zion. Like, it becomes this sort of thing where it like encompasses the whole land. It's like
icon.
It's an icon, yeah. And even now we talk about Zionists or whatever, and it has different connotations. But it's like all comes from this one mountain, from this one conquest that David did, and we're still talking about Zion. And so, like, this is so interesting to me that it is that callback to trust the Lord throughout the generations, really.
It reminds me of one of my favorites, Jeremiah 17:8. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He's like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when the heat comes, for Arizona people.
Yes.
For its leaves remain green, and it is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. That just reminded me of that because it's very similar, but I love that verse in Jeremiah.
It's the same thing. It's like a confidence in the Lord that
the Arizona version.
You don't cease to bear fruit. Like, again, like, it's impossible for me to say I won't cease bearing fruit unless the Lord is with me.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's completely impossible to say I'm going to be bulletproof my whole life and I'm never going to be shaken and I'm never, unless the Lord's with me. And then it's like, I'll go through some difficult seasons, but I know that the Lord's with me, and that's that stability I think that the psalmist is calling us into. So.
Now, Ryan, it sounded like on Sunday you had some more thoughts about the next passage. The next verse was talking about the scepter of the wicked.
Yes.
Or the scepter of wickedness.
Now this is interesting because I think this is what made me want to preach this. But it feels like maybe it's just me, but sometimes you'll read verses and you're just like, I don't know, like that's, or you have like your first pass at it. And my first pass at this verse was like, wicked people do bad things, good people do good things. Lord, make sure the good people like that's what I was thinking this was saying. And then I started going back at it going, okay, I think there's something here, But the verse in verse 4, it says this: for the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous. Now, scepter just is this pretty common biblical word, just meaning power. So the scepter of power, like the power of the wicked. So it's saying the power of the wicked, it shall not rest. So it won't stay over the land allotted to the righteous. Allotted meaning it's been set aside, it's been given to the righteous. So you've got this idea of like this righteous group of people, this righteous nation. It has wickedness in terms of its leadership above it, and that wickedness won't rest over the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. And I think my first pass again maybe my second or third pass at this, then I was going, okay, well, then the fear would be like if there's somebody evil that's over righteous people, then the temptation would be like, let's overthrow the evil, But that Tremper Longman quote, and actually Brueggemann also had a really great quote about this. The fear is not that the righteous people will rise up and overthrow the evil. The fear is that the righteous people would emulate the evil. Like that's the highest fear of this verse. Like, Lord, it can't stand. Like if there are evil people in charge, Lord, let it not stand so that we aren't tempted to continue to do the evil that we see, And I think my mind just started going to all sorts of things. Like we, as parents of a teenager, like I hear about, and it's true, it's exponentially rising, but the amount of teenagers that are shoplifting is going through the roof for some reason. Well, not for some reason. You could start to look around and you go, well, not just those who are in power. I mean, you look at California and they've got signs going, hey, as long as you steal under $950, you're fine. Yeah. We think that doesn't affect us, but it does. So the people that are in charge are going, well, it's okay to steal some, And then with social media, people in California are stealing, and then our kids are seeing that on social media going, well, nothing's happening to them. And eventually it trickles down into this place where they're like, well, maybe I should just steal some stuff too, And this is one example of, thousands, I think, that are going on right now, where when that sort of thing is going on, you start to see that it actually does affect us on the other way. And I think that was like when I read this and, it's 4th of July weekend, you're thinking about America, you're thinking about your country, and what do I say about it, And I think that in a lot of ways that we don't like to talk like this because in kind of a New Testament paradigm, and I ended with this encouragement, like the church works in the opposite direction. A lot of times we are not in the place of power. Most times we're not. And actually when we're in the place of power, sometimes it breeds corruption. But what happens is we're the thing that is undermining that sort of idea, and we're pushing it back the other way, And as the church grows, it does affect things. It does change things. This is the kingdom that our leader is not the president. Our leader is Jesus. So those of us in that kingdom, like, we're doing fine. Like, but I think there is that reality, and we don't like to say this, but I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy because there's a verse in here I was reading this morning, but it says, "Know therefore today and lay it in your heart that the Lord your God is in heaven above and earth beneath, and there is no other. Therefore you shall keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land that the Lord is giving you for all time." This idea that the righteousness of a people determines the future of that people is not it's not thrown out in a New Testament paradigm. The kingdom itself, like our kingdom, works differently, obviously. But when you look at the kingdoms of the world, when there is unrighteousness, what happens is that culture starts to die. It starts to fall apart. Like it's not a comment on salvation. It's just a comment on the gravity of the world and the gravity of things that the Lord says, hey, if you follow my statutes, things are going to go well with you. And I think we shy away from that in some ways because we're afraid to be, maybe legalistic or whatever it is. And you can't slip into that.
Well, it's also worth saying that it's as much as it's like a decree from on high, the Lord removing blessing or this or that or whatever, it's also a statement of the functional order of the world and of societies.
Yes.
Which is to say, you depart from the Lord and stuff's going to crumble.
Yeah.
It's just how it works.
Let's take what I was just talking about, stealing. So, okay, well, it's becoming more and more popular for young people to steal because, you start to see some governmental people saying it's okay, and then that starts to shift culture. And then what eventually happens is businesses have to close, right? Because they're like, well, people are stealing,
Yeah.
Like, and then when businesses close, then people can't buy things anymore. And they're like, what's going on here? You see that happening, and you could kind of watch it happen in a culture. A lack of righteousness in the culture ends up just deteriorating it, and that's just what happens.
In the village that is very dear to many of our hearts in Belize, Gales Point, Belize, where Dave and Brittany spent a good chunk of their life. They spent 9 months living there at one point in time, and a year and a half living about a half-hour drive from there. And many of us have gone down there countless times. I have a goddaughter who was born in that village. Well, I think she was born in the city, but in that village, they years and years and years ago, they used to have a bus that ran there. But that village is known in Belize as, kind of a sketchy place for a somewhat sketchy country. It's historically was kind of the vacation spot of some big time gang leaders and stuff like that, and definitely a recruiting center there. And the bus used to run there regularly a couple times a week, which was great because then they could get to the city and get groceries or get to the town or get out of the village. But at one point in time, there was like such a consistent problem with some of the villagers, not all of them, but a handful of the young men robbing people on the bus and the bus driver. And so then the bus driver said, okay, we'll just not go to that village ever again.
Yeah.
And so for like 10, 15 years, the villagers did not have a bus. So they had to hoof it or hitchhike if they wanted to get out of the village.
Yeah.
And only recently with a new road being paved and stuff as it returned it cost them dearly. A few young men who decided to compromise their integrity and to take what wasn't theirs.
Yeah.
Cost the whole village for 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And it's not just, it's not just a spiritual principle.
Yeah.
It's just a reality principle. We're trying to operate outside of the laws that God built society on and humanity on. And so when we do that, it just like it says in Deuteronomy, so that it'll go well with you. Like that's the reason the Lord says, here's laws, are not so that you could check off the box and say, I followed the laws. God's going, I'm giving this to you because it's what's best for you. Yeah. It literally, it's just that paradigm shift. It's pushing back on the flesh. It's all of that of going, this is where we prosper. And the call for me, and this is where I was just trying to, really try to call out for people, like, let's keep praying for America, that we could have our moral compass set back, because the morality of the people really does matter.
Yeah.
Now, if America's on a downward trend, and fine, but let us at least be a people that care enough about it to talk about it and to pray for our own country. And I think there is a sensitivity that I think a little part of me is I'm a little tired of, because I think if I go to Peru and they're praying for the success of Peru, I don't go, ooh, tisk, tisk, don't do that, But if you come to America and you're like, I'm praying for America, everyone's like, ooh, careful,
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, no, this is a country that I live in, and I want to raise my kids in it, and I want the best for it, and I'm going to pray for the best of it. But to remember, our problems don't come from politics; they come from morality, and that's always been the case. And the church could push the tide back on that; it absolutely can. But that's where, this psalm just really, it hit me so strong. I was going, our problems are not Biden and Trump, and it's not that whatever we could talk about. Our problem is that we're losing a sense of morality in our culture. And instead of feeling out of control in it, we have to try to get people back into this place of going, well, watch the boundaries of your own life. Watch the boundaries of your kids' lives. If you've got grandkids, like, tell them about the Lord and the boundaries that are good, and the life that, and the kind of morality that, it's not there to earn salvation, but it's there to have a better life and a better culture. We should be the voice saying that. And this is that call back and that prayer going, Lord, do good to those who do good, and those who are doing evil, just kick them out, please. Let this be a place where goodness reigns.
I think in our worship ministry over the last year and a half, we really prioritized discipleship and working on building young worship leaders that are deep wells, that and I think just in general, even Kurt in the staff meeting today gave a word about it's like discipleship or whatever, and I was like, yes, that's what I've been doing. I'm glad that or what I've been trying to do. I don't know. It sounds a little arrogant to be like, yes, I've been
I'm killing it.
But
we were all judging you.
It's what I'm trying. That's what I'm trying to do. But if we don't disciple the next generation and they don't have the figures in their life that are investing in them, then where are they going to be invested from? Well, probably TikTok, probably Instagram Reels, is going to teach them about life. And that's terrifying, There's so much
you laugh because it's sad.
Crazy stuff on there that is not good,
Well, and I think for the young generation too, and I've been feeling this for at least the last 3 years, real strong the last 2 years for sure. But I think that we've both, for the young generation, we kind of stuck in this sort of perpetual kid mode, And if we're going to be honest, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm so sorry to offend anybody, but the baby boomer generation is also kind of a big kid generation. When you see, they were called the me generation, and so you see even now, it's like you see the Senate or any of these things, it's like they won't really let go of power, and they perpetually look at anybody younger than them as these kids who can't do anything. I'm in my 40s now, and I still feel like, I can't do any of this. And I'm like, I think we have to push back on that. And I think for the younger generation, and it's not the baby boomers' fault completely, but it's like, and this is what happens in generations. But for our generation, I think we have to get back to that discipleship, that discipling mentality, and say, hey, I got to grow up in the Spirit. I got to grow up in my walk with Christ, and I have to disciple other people. And I have to not perpetually sit around and think of myself as a child. I have to really look at myself and say, hey, I've made some mistakes, but I followed Jesus for X amount of years, and I have something to bring to somebody who's 17 or 18 and or 25 and they're trying to figure out life. Fine, like whatever it is, whatever land's been allotted to you, do it with purpose and put discipleship forward. Without that, you're right. It's like we get this sort of shallow root system sort of Christian, and we can't have that anymore. I think that's a luxury when you're in a country that's like kind of mostly Christian or culturally Christian or whatever you could call it the last couple of generations. We just don't have that anymore. So what we're left with is we need strong disciples. And just like you said, it's discipleship. And it's not a worship leader that sings all the right notes and plays all your favorite songs. It's a worship leader who knows the presence of God, who's put in the miles, who loves Jesus. They could be 23 I've met some 23-year-olds that I'm like, you're amazingly mature for your age, But it comes with time with the Lord, and somebody discipling them into that if they're not there.
I think a big part of the discipleship process, and if you are someone that's listening to this and you're like discipling someone right now, what you say is one thing, but what you value is another thing. So if you value influence and you value opportunities and you value, platform and all these things, the people that you are discipling, no matter what you say, will value those things because they'll see it in your, the way that you go about your business, I guess.
Yeah.
So what I've been realizing lately is like when I came into ministry a year and a half ago, it was in a season of my life where I'd given up. Like I had tried so hard to be in ministry for so long. And I finally just found this healthy rhythm working in the warehouse and roasting coffee, and I was enjoying myself, and I let it go. And I was like, all right, Lord, you can have that one. I'm just going to live in this warehouse and do it. And I'm not even saying that like a self-deprecating thing. I literally found peace just being in the warehouse with the Lord.
I agree because I saw you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the Lord like elected me into office. It wasn't like something that I set out to do. And I think that base of coming into ministry on that pretense it set me up in a way where I just realized that I've heard someone say every door that you kick down or you force yourself into, now you have to sustain that.
Yep. Whatever effort you
put into, you must sustain it.
You got to say it.
So if you just focus on the Lord and you focus on your depth with Jesus, I know this sounds so like Sunday school, and you just let him decide how far it goes or where he puts you. And you just let him elect you into office. Yeah. If it's ministry, that's awesome.
Yep.
Like, Lord, thank you for as long as I'm here elected to this office until you take me out. I'm thankful for that.
Yeah. Who you are, you multiply. Like,
exactly.
You could tell somebody by the disciples they make.
Yeah. I'm so glad that I was not a pastor then when all I wanted was to be a pastor and to seek that platform and influence on that stuff. Like, praise God that I did not, that I wasn't super, attractive and charismatic and someone just gave me the job early when I wasn't ready. Yeah. Because
there's a lot of people you could see like that.
Yes.
Like you were given that job because everyone looks at you and you're like, that guy's cool. Let's give him that opportunity.
Well, and I think like what you just said is so solid, right? Like what you value is really important, and you're reproducing that and you're passing that down. And I think to put myself on a little bit of thin ice and share some Alec thoughts that are not necessarily Living Streams thoughts, although I don't necessarily think they're contrary to the what we would feel. But I think some of this I feel pretty solid, and some of it you'll see when I hit the thin ice here. But I think more to what you were saying as far as like the morality of our society, the morality of our culture is important. And I think integrity is one of these things that we've lost, like we just compromised on sometime in the last 10, 15 years. And we replaced it with pragmatism. Particularly, I think we've had long, robust conversations over the last couple of years about, and we're having them 20 minutes ago about, hey, the Lord is in charge, and whoever's in charge, the Lord is still in charge.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we do live in a democracy where we pick who's in charge. Mm-hmm. And so to some extent, because of the structure of the government that we live under, we get what we deserve. We get what I don't know, deserve is the wrong word.
I don't disagree with that.
But
That's fine.
we get what we ask for. How about that? That's literally true. We get what we ask for. And we stopped asking for integrity.
Yes.
And there's a certain extent to which we can say, hey, I didn't ask for this lack of integrity, and maybe that's true. But we have to put on our collectivist hat, which is very un-American, to say, I am American. I am part of this country. And even if I couldn't vote in this country, I am still a part of this. And so whoever is in charge, I'm tied to, even if I didn't vote for them. And I'm a part of and again, because it's democracy, it's even more clear. Because we get to vote, because we get to choose, even if I don't vote for this person who's in charge, well, I'm a part of influencing this culture and this society. And so if my neighbor picked this, well, that is a reflection actually on me and how I'm interacting with my neighbor to some extent. And so I think when we started saying, you know what, we don't care that our politicians even do a good job pretending they have integrity anymore. And I'm just going to vote because I'm voting against that person who I think has less integrity. And this is where I'm getting on the thin ice, and this is an Alec thought. It's 100% Alec thought. Be mad at me, no one else here.
Shut it down, Dalton. No,
I personally,
Dalton's got his finger on the stop button.
Although I'm okay with however anybody else particularly comes up, and I really do believe that people ought to be praying and seeking the Lord and obeying the Lord when it comes to their vote. I personally have a bit of a beef with hey, if you don't vote for X, that means you're voting for Y. Because of the fact that we have a system where actually you can write in anybody you want. We're actually not literally forced between blue and red in our society, in our government. Now, pragmatically speaking, I 100% understand that argument, and mathematically, you're probably right. But my conviction is to vote integrity, and so I have found myself in multiple elections recently, feeling like I can't cast my vote with this person or with that person. And some may say it's flushing my vote, and if you feel that way, I'm sorry. I promise I've done my things prayerfully, which I'm not saying the Lord is telling you to vote the same way, but for me, it's a sense of I can't say that I cast my lot in with this person or that person, and so if I need to, I'll write in. And to be honest, I'm considering Mark Buckley for president.
I'd be all for that. Mark listens to this all the time. So if you're listening, Mark,
so Mark, you might just have a vote.
Throw your hat in the ring, Mark.
You were onto some pay dirt, though, I think, with that. At least they were pretending to be. So this is one of those things, again, like we look back and we go, oh my gosh. And again, I'm not advocating for people to pretend to be Christian. But politicians pretending to be Christian was a result of a righteous people. Like ultimately, we were a people that they were like, if you're doing shenanigans behind the scenes, you'll lose your election. So if you're cheating on your wife, you should hide it because we're not going to vote for you.
I mean, think of the response to Clinton and his affair was outrage.
Where's
the outrage on any of the things?
John F. Kennedy, like he swept all that stuff under the rug. So, but there was at least enough morality in the people that the politicians were like, I got to at least hide this, you know. Just not the case anymore. Now they're just kind of like, whatever, And I think that, not that I was longing for fake politicians, which I think they're always fake, let's just be honest. But what I think it shows is, again, kind of back to this principle in Psalm 125, where like the land of the righteous, like they're going, we can't tolerate that. Like you got to at least hide it from us, like, and if you morally fall as a leader, we're done, know. But I think even, and now I think we're into some new territory, but even all the stuff that's going on at Gateway, I don't know if you guys are caught up on all of that. Heartbreaking stuff. Another leader morally falling, actually, not just morally falling, like underage. I won't say too much about it, but bad stuff, And Robert Morris is a very influential guy, biggest church in America for a long time. I don't know if it still is. And I you see all of that stuff that's going on, and it's like, it's affecting church leadership like crazy right now too. I think the temptation is to say that it's the sin that caused the fall. And I think this is where the Lord is really adjusting things in our heart posture. But what you just said about church leadership, And maybe we're getting inside baseball. And if you're not a church leader, I'm so sorry if we're going off on a tangent. But for church leaders, the fall was only the thing that happened that got the attention. But it was the heart posture that got them to that point. And I do think it comes back to all the way back to, when Israel said, we want a king. And God's like, you don't want a king. And Israel said, no, we do. All the other nations have one. We want one. And God's like, this is what's going to happen to your kids. This is what's going to happen to your grandkids. You're not going to like this at all. And they said, we don't care. We want a king. And I think that for the church to mature in this next season, blaming the leader is easy, but looking at ourselves and the things that we allow as like the things that not allow, that's a bad word for it. The sort of leader that we promote is actually the problem. So we are looking for the tall, articulate, good-looking, like never faltering sort of thing. And the thing with Gateway, when you look back, and I know there's a lot of different conversation about it, but all of their language is so careful, saying none of the current elders knew that this was going on. The kind of back-end flavor you get from that is, well, then the elders at the time, did they know? It seems like it. And it seems like there were at least some elders that said, well, I know Robert Morris is basically a pedophile right now, but I'm going to sweep it under the rug, and he apologized, and we're all good now. And you could only ask yourself, well, why would they do that? Why on earth would they possibly do that? They loved his sermons, and he was a leader that they felt comfortable with, and they loved everything that he would say, and he was so clear about things. And ultimately, it was that sin that causes the problem. It's that sin that says, I don't trust the Lord to be king. I trust this human to be king. And every single time it will let you down. It just won't work. Yeah. It just doesn't work anymore. And I think the Lord is lovingly undoing that. But I mean, I think one of the things about the millennial generation becoming, this happened a couple of years ago. Now all of a sudden the millennial generation there's more millennials coming to church than baby boomers for the first time in a long time. Well, since the baby boomers were going to church. And the millennial generation, I think, is a lot less enamored with people who pretend to be perfect. And I think that's a positive of the millennials. I think they're going to go, I don't want somebody that acts like they've got it all together. I don't want somebody, because we see it time and time again. It's failed, Yeah. And my prayer is that obviously that it infects the church first, because like we're praying for politics, right? Like we're praying for our leaders to have morality, and we're praying for our society to have morality as Americans, but it has to start in the church. Like we have to clean house a bit. We have to be the ones that raise the bar, understanding that what we do then does affect what happens at large. But you read these stories and the temptation is to just throw Robert Morris out, and you're like, but actually we need to look inward. Like the church has to look at ourselves and go, we keep doing this over and over. And it doesn't matter if you got a church of 100,000 people or you got a church of 100 people. We tend to keep doing this thing where it's like, if they make me feel good and they say all the right things, then I'm going to put them in charge. And I think we have to stop skipping over the church when we're talking about politics. We have to start at the church.
Yeah, integrity needs to be a prerequisite for promotion.
Yes.
And it needs to be a prerequisite, I think, for a certain level of your attention.
Yeah.
Like I remember being a kid and my parents instilling me really well with this idea, which I'm realizing as I'm about to articulate it, that it's probably a relatively rare thing. My parents parented well in this regard. Hopefully maybe not as rare in the church, but they made clear to me over years and years and years of parenting that like there are different places in your heart that different friends can take, or can sit in, right? And there is a friend with whom you have a full sharing, right? Where you take and you receive and you hear and you listen and you give and it's the same, right? And then there's a friend that's a friend that you can have closeness and you can love them and you can enjoy them, but you can impart to them, but you ought not to receive from them. Which doesn't mean that like, oh, they can't buy you lunch, and it doesn't mean that you don't listen politely. But when they're giving you counsel, you let that fall off your heart like like water off a duck's back. You know,
Yeah.
like this person is not that they're a bad person, but they are a sinful person who doesn't know they need Jesus.
Yeah.
And so the counsel they're giving you is not godly counsel. Do not receive that counsel unless, of course, the Lord is using them, clearly. But in general, that's the posture of which again hopefully doesn't to them feel like they're a second tier friend or anything like that. You know, there was a lot of nuance in how my parents raised me here.
Yeah.
But to say like, hey, don't give them influence over your heart unless they're really humbly following the Lord. And I think we ought to do that when it comes to leaders in the world is there integrity? And if there's not, I don't give you influence over my heart, or at least guard my heart against it as much as I can, unless it's clear the Lord is using you to speak.
And that's where politics can get kind of dicey. You know, it's like where, there's certain politicians that you're just like, well, they're a politician, you know.
Yeah.
There's certain politicians, you know, like, I mean, Trump obviously is one of them, and Barack Obama, people like that, where people attach more than just politics to them. It's like, I trust them on a very deep level. And it's like, well, just be careful with that. You know, like draw some boundaries there because, again, it's not the church. But I would say even with church leaders, like there are some church leaders that you go, and it's so easy these days. Just hop on YouTube and go, you know who I love is this pastor. I'm going to follow everything that this person says. And you're like, well, I won't name any names. I'm thinking of one that's very influential. And I'd say like 90% of what this guy says is great. But then there's like that 10% where you're just like, oh, don't listen to that though. Like, careful. Like, have some discernment in that. And I think that's where we come full circle back into like worship and the value of worship. Because you're gaining the heart from the Father, like you're actually spending time with Jesus, and that's where I think we exit out of Bible study and we come into like Holy Spirit living, where it's like there are some great principles, some things that we could look at the world around us. We could call the world around us to some more righteousness. We could call ourselves to more righteousness. All of that. At the end of the day, what's super, super important, and you have to couple both of these together, is the discernment of the Holy Spirit. And that's only cultivated with time with him. You know, you spend time with him enough, you get that prick in your heart and you go, oh, that's no longer, like, that's not okay, you know? Yeah. And I've had that with some people that I really admire or look up to in my touring days, you know, where I'm touring with leaders that I really do look up to. Every now and then they'd say something and I'd go, oh, I don't want to adapt that into my life, you know? Or occasionally you're like, that sounds so good, but I don't think that's right, you know?
Yeah.
And eventually something kind of breaks in their life and you go, I thought so. Thank you, Holy Spirit. You know, like it's not my own wisdom, it's yours, you know? Yeah. And that's what we need.
Let's, for the sake of actually getting where we said we were going to get and where the
that's
teacher
right.
Ryan really wants to,
yes.
Let's turn the page real quick to Psalm 126.
Yeah, this is a good place to land.
You wanted to preach on Psalm 126 and didn't get to. So podcast, that's what the podcast is. Yeah. For you and me and David, that's what the podcast is for.
So I think coming back around. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about morality, and none of this is to, like, this is all like balancing, I think, trying to keep us balanced. But it's like the morality of the people, your own morality, those things do matter, you know. But then in the merciful heart of God, God is so good to take something that's really broken like us and do something really beautiful out of it. Beauty for ashes, or whatever phrases we want to say from the Bible, this idea that God will turn it around. And Psalm 126, I mean, I just think we spent so much time talking about exile. 126 is them coming back. Like, this is them. They went to Babylon for 70 years, and it sucked, and it was terrible. And they remembered the Lord. Jeremiah spoke to them. There was all sorts of things that were wonderful about it, but they went through some real hardship. And then Psalm 126 is, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Like, there's just this idea, and I think so much of us, at least for me, maybe because I'm more melancholy, I love to talk about, okay, how do you find the Lord in these sort of broken times, or these like dark times, or these times where you're not really feeling it, you know? But then there are those times that you feel it. Like, that's okay, you know? And this is it. This is like the fortunes of Zion. We were like those who were in a dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. And I think this is just a psalm of coming back home, and the psalmist says this phrase twice: "You restored the fortunes of Zion, restore our fortunes, O Lord," in verse 4. This idea of God brought it back together. He restored it all, And I think for so many of us, this is the story of Jesus, right? This is where the New Testament comes crashing into our reality of God has restored our fortunes, whether we feel like it or not. Jesus has restored our fortunes. We have an eternal house to go to. We have an end date that's happening that only He knows, but there is an end date for all the suffering and crying and pain of the world. God has already restored our fortunes. And I think probably because I struggle with this the most, I wanted to preach a message that was don't forget your fortunes are restored. Don't forget it's already happened. Don't forget that you already have it. No matter what happens in the election, no matter what happens with your boss, no matter what happens with, the strained relationships in your family, there is a restoration of the Lord for you, between you and Him, that is guaranteed. Our fortunes have already turned around. And He says this: "Those who sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." So just this idea of again, this kind of figurative guy who's got nothing. He's just got seeds, and he's planting whatever he's got. The Lord's going to make it so He brings home these sheaves, these stacks of whatever the crop is, and He's going to bring that home. He's going to be fruitful in his life. And it just for me, and I'd said this the first service, but Matthew chapter 5, this planting language, when Jesus, and I always think it's so good when we're studying the Old Testament, to land where Jesus, ties in, but He opened His mouth in verse 2 in the Sermon on the Mount, and He said this: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And that language of you're sowing in tears, but you're reaping with joy. Psalm 126 is the story of God saying, "I'm going to bring you back home," and then He does it. And there's so much to be said in the longing before that happens. But to maybe, I think for me, to cast my emotional well-being onto that day and to go, there will be a day when the trumpet sounds and we're going to be laughing. What else could we do but to go, it's all been undone. Everything I've been just so starving for my whole life, it's happened. It's been restored, And I think for us to not just borrow the stories of when God came into something terrible and made it better, but when God restored it completely. And it was we couldn't stop laughing about it, And I think there's maybe for some of us, the last time that happened was when we were kids, and maybe the Lord's, given us a lot of great blessing. But as we look back on our lives, and I think as I'm getting older, it's getting easier for this to be the case. But I look back on my life and I think of all the hardship and all the things I wished happened or I didn't see happen, or I'm frustrated didn't happen. And I forget, man, Lord, You've brought me into Your kingdom fully restored. Give me some joy back in it. Help me to laugh a little bit. Help me to have some joy back in my life. I think that's why these sort of Psalms are in there. It's borrow some of that joy.
Yeah. Yeah. The resetting our understanding of what's good, what's right, what's to be enjoyed and appreciated. And, not to steal my thunder from 2 weeks from now, but it's interesting. So I'm preaching on 127 next week or this coming week, and then 128 the following week in 128 is saying, blessed is he who fears the Lord, and da-da-da-da. And as I was digging around a little bit, I found Tim Mackey with the Bible Project talking. I was doing a bit of a word study on that word blessed.
You've reached your limit, though. You can only mention Tim Mackey twice.
Only
I'm just
twice.
joking. I'm just joking.
Only twice. You can mention Tim Mackey as much as you want.
As much as you want. I'm just teasing you.
He's pretty, man, anytime.
Yeah.
Anytime you want to dig a little bit deeper.
So he really, if you don't know Tim Mackey, you really should.
It just gets packed, so off. If it's not their podcast, it's packed in a nice, clean little cartoon,
Yes.
So double bonus. But but they were talking about doing a little word study on the Hebrew words for blessing, right? And in particular, looking at the Beatitudes, which is written in Greek, but Jesus would have delivered that sermon in Aramaic, which is, a daughter language to Hebrew, of course. And they're saying there's two words, and the word that Jesus would have been using when he was preaching in Aramaic would have been asher versus baruch, which is the word for baruch is to bless something. The word for asher, the way they said, maybe we would rather translate it, the good life is for the poor in spirit. The good life is for those who are persecuted. And it's this word that's used predominantly, if not exclusively, to actually try to paint a picture and a vision for what it is to be blessed, like what is already a preconditioned state of blessing. And then it goes on to then say, and the blessing comes from this, but and the
I
way
love that preconditioned state of blessing. That's exactly.
And
what it is.
the thing that my mind goes to is country songs, right? Of like, it just crack open a beer and sit down with your dog and enjoy the wilderness, like just that's the life. Yeah. And I think that's what 128 is saying for sure, and I think that's what Jesus is saying in the Beatitudes. I think that's what we're seeing here is like, this is the good life.
Yeah.
And the Psalms of Ascent, once they kind of turn this page that they're turning in 126, and they start to be more look up instead of like, hey, we're looking up, but like now we're already looking up.
Yes. Yeah.
Like once they hit that point, they start to paint a picture of, that's the good life. That's a beer with your dog on the back porch kind of life, and it's this, like we're reaping, we're having children, we're having the blessings of the Lord, we're connecting with God who's merciful, like we're rejoicing. So
it's like Jeremiah 29. It's kind of saying the same thing, like even in exile, just put in some roots with the Lord, have kids, enjoy things, plant a garden, and there is that sort of, I think, restore our fortunes, O Lord, and remind us that we've already been restored is really, that's my Reader's Digest 126 sermon.
Yeah. Well, great. That is, I think, a wonderful, solid place to be wrapping up. Thanks so much, Ryan, for walking us through two Psalms, a Psalm and a bonus Psalm today.
Little bonus.
Yeah, thanks, David McVicker, for being with us, hanging out.
Yeah. Being at the right place at the right time.
Yeah,
that's right.
Sharing with us just your worship leader's perspective that is so in tune with how do we approach the Lord. And that is so much the Psalms of Ascent, right? How do we get our hearts in a posture to come back to the Lord, to be his children? So thanks for sharing that perspective, and thank you guys for listening, for hanging with us, for being willing to listen to us talk about very weird things and not getting too angry when we have thoughts on how one might want to vote or strange things like that.
If you're offended by it at all, just email David Stockton.
David Stockton at livingstreams.org. He's not even here, but his job is to take the heat. So anyway, thank you guys so much. Please follow, like, subscribe if that's something that you feel like you want to do. We really just love digging in a little bit deeper to the Word of God and chatting with each other. And like we always say, this is just really cathartic for whoever preached on Sunday to get to share those extra thoughts. So we appreciate you wanting to tune in and hang with us. So we love you guys. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on Sunday.